Welcome to the 2015 Foothill Debate Club Showcase, featuring two of our best teams at Foothill High School Speech and Debates. On your left side, from Foothill High School, we have Bernie Nguyen. On your right side, we have Arthur Wong and Bryce Van. So we are Foothill High School Speech and Debate Clubs, and if you want to visit our website, check out foothilldebate.com. Next slide. So let's start off with what our club does. So as the Speech and Debate Club, we sponsor various tournaments throughout the year, tournaments involving speech and debate, such as the debate that you'll see in a moment. We also help train students for speech and debate, and so we hold a lot of workshops that will be held throughout the year. Next slide. So before the round commences, we'll briefly go over the topics that they'll be covering, the format and the rules of this form of debate, and we'll introduce our teams a little bit more in depth. Next slide. Next slide. So the resolution today will be resolved. On balance, the benefits of genetically modified foods outweigh the harms. So feel free to write this down if you want. We'll refer to this resolution throughout the round. So this is what the two teams will be debating on. Next slide. So just a little bit of background information. So the debate that we're going to be doing today is called public forum debate. And public forum debate generally revolves around current events issues. So one of the major reasons that this issue is so important today is that a lot of countries have begun passing genetically modified food labeling laws. And as a result, this is an issue that is very important in today's world. It has a lot of economic ramifications. For example, Chipotle recently passed a law, decided to ban all genetically modified foods, and so this is something that affects you guys. Next slide. Next slide. So today's form of debate is called public forum. In public forum, we have two teams. Each team has two debaters. We'll have a first speaker and a second speaker, and these two speakers will fulfill different roles. Next slide. So when you're watching today's debates, you'll notice 4 different types of speeches. The first speech will be a case constructive, and in the case constructive, both teams will present a prepared case that they have already practiced on. After that, they'll give an impromptu rebuttal on the case of the opposing team. Next, the first speaker will come back and give a summary of the rounds. And finally, we'll end with a final focus, in which these two teams will try to convince you to vote for their side. In between every set of these speeches, we'll have a cross-examination, in which teams will be able to ask the other teams questions about the debate and how to frame their arguments. Next slide. So here you can look briefly at what the speech order will be. With the case constructives are 4 minutes each, the crossfires in between will be 3 minutes each, the rebuttals will be 4 minutes each, summaries 2 minutes, and the final focus will also be 2 minutes. Throughout this debate, each team will also have 2 minutes of preparation time, which we will be allowed to allocate however we want. Next slide. So we highly recommend that you take some notes for this debate round because you will be able to decide the victor at the end of this round through a vote. The way we usually take notes for our debate is through what is called the flow. And in the flow, if you can see this diagram over here, essentially you create columns for each speech. Usually you want to put the affirmative on top and the negative on the bottom. And for every argument that they make, put it in the corresponding column. And every time the opposing team makes a response to that argument, you can draw a line connecting that argument to the response. And that allows you to keep track of the argument progression throughout the rounds. So I can give you guys some time to take a piece of paper if you're interested. Next slide. So now let's introduce the debaters. So a moment I know you guys have all been waiting for. Next slide. Next slide. So let's start off with Dhruva and Bernie. Dhruva and Bernie are currently in their first year of debate, but they have already performed very well. They have already won an entire tournament at the Santa Clara University Invitational, and they also received second speaker, which is a very high prestigious award for being the second best speaker at the tournament. They also were a champion. They were a champion at 2 different Santa Clara tournaments. And they were also a semi-finalist at the Stanford Invitational, which is one of the most prestigious invitationals in the local area. And they also achieved 5th speaker. So can I have a round of applause for them? So facing them will be Arthur Huang and Bryce Fan. Arthur Huang and Bryce Fan have put in the most debate experience at Foothill High School. They have qualified for the Tournament of the Champions, which is the single most prestigious debate tournament on the national circuit. In doing so, required to placing extremely high on two very prestigious tournaments on the national circuit. So these two teams, this team is actually very highly ranked in the nation. In fact, they are 62nd in the nation with a 16-8 win-loss record against other nationally ranked teams. And they are former champions of the Presentation Invitational and SCU Invitational. So can I have a round of applause for Bryce Miller? Next slide, until TC Pro Case. Wait, go back to TC Pro Case. You see it? TC Pro Case. Okay. So now we're going to decide which team affirms and which team negates the resolution. I'll be flipping a coin, and the team that wins the coin toss will get to choose either to speak first or second, or they can choose whether they want to affirm or negate the resolution. And as you can see, debate rounds generally force teams to prepare on both sides as well as possible. So since Bernie is my favorite debater here, he will get to choose the coin flip. When I flip the coin, call your side onto the air. Heads or tails? Could someone see what that flips? Okay, it's heads. Okay, so Bertie chooses the affirmative, so the other team, well, you guys will be speaking seconds. So, round of applause and let the round begin.
Time begins. We affirm the resolution. On balance, the benefits of genetically modified foods outweigh the harms. To clarify definition 1, Merriam-Webster defines a genetically modified organism as an organism whose genome has been altered in order to favor the expression of desired physiological traits or the output of desired biological products. A cost-benefit analysis will be used as a framework for this round. Additionally, observation 1, the first GMO consumer product was implemented only 20 years ago. As this is a new technology which continues to grow, weigh the potential in tandem with the current. Contention 1, improved yield. The meta-analysis conducted by Wilhelm Kumper and Dr. Martin Keim of the George August University of Göttingen in Germany examines the effects of GM crops at a global scale, including 147 original studies from all over the world that report impacts of GM soybean, maize, and/or cotton crop yields, pesticide use, and/or farmer profits. The authors found the crop yield increased by 22% and increased farmer profits by 68%. It was found that yield and profit gains are higher in developing countries. As an example case study, South Africa. According to the Academy of Science of South Africa, a study published in 2005 involving 368 small and resource-poor farmers indicated that BT maize, or genetically modified corn, resulted in an 11% higher yield, a cost saving in insecticides equivalent to a 60% cost reduction, and an increased income of US $117 per hectare farm. Yang Wang from the Plant Journal continues, a reduction in irrigation by 50% caused a 14% reduction in seed yield of DH12075, the unmodified strain. But the yield of YTP, or GM canola lines, was unaffected. Impact: developing countries can benefit greatly from adopting GM crops. Major increases and improvements in yields and profits generated make them extremely valuable to small farmers in developing countries, who make up the vast majority of GM usage. According to Sheetal and Meechan, 2012 was the first year in which developing countries grew a majority of the total GM harvest, or 52% globally. 17.3 million farmers grew GM crops around the world. Around 90% of these were small-holding farmers in developing countries. Additionally, economic impacts. According to PG Economics from November 2013, farmers in developing countries received $3.74 for each dollar invested in GM crop seeds in 2012. Contention 2, environmental benefits. Klumper and Keim, in their same study of 147 original surveys, found that GM technology has reduced chemical pesticide usage by 37%. Charles Connor, the president of the National Council of Farmer Cooperatives, supports it, saying the adoption of biotechnology products has encouraged the expansion of no-till cultivation. The increased use of no-till reduces herbicide costs by 20 to 50%, erosion by 90%, greenhouse gas emissions by 88%, and fuel use by 20 to 50%. The impacts are monumental. PG Economics reports continuously, in April of 2009, the results from less fuel use and additional soil carbon storage from reduced tillage with biotech crops was equivalent to removing 14.2 billion kilograms of carbon dioxide per year, or equivalent to removing 6.3 billion cars from the road for 1 year. And for all these reasons, we strongly affirm the following resolution.
Votes ready? Further? All of you guys?
Yeah.
Yep. Thank you. Because Bryce and I believe the only thing that has to be genetically modified in today's round is their entire pro case, we engage. Contention 1, monocultures. Monoculture is the agricultural practice of producing or growing a single variety of crop over a wide area and for a large number of consecutive years. The Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations states 75% of plant genetic diversity have been lost as farmers turn to genetically reuniform, mass-produced crop varieties. Genetically modified crops reinforce genetic homogeneity and increase vulnerability of crops to climate change, pests, and diseases. Mass production may seem efficient, but economic and agricultural sustainability is harmed because nations using monoculture often become too reliant on a single crop. First impact is financial instability. West Jackson of the Land Institute explains when an entire region depends on a single crop and an unusual weather pattern devastates the crop, the region's economy is also devastated. Empirically, Jack Hyman of the University of Canterbury found that an area where GM crops were grown, yields were actually lower because the weather changed and it fluctuated. Second is increased pests. D.A. Andau of the University of Minnesota analyzed 290 studies on GM foods, which involved 287 different pest species and concluded that monocultures increase the presence of pests because of reduced genetic variation. As a result of reduced biodiversity, for example, in Southeast Asia, yields actually decreased 94%. Contention 2, genetic contamination. Miguel Altieri, professor of agroecology at UC Berkeley, explains that it is certain that GM crops share genes with other crops when they are together. Genetic contamination of organic farms and other systems, and it is unlikely that transgenes can be retracted once they have escaped, thus damage to the purity of non-GM seeds is permanent. Empirically, according to Hastings International Comparative Law Review, when they examined corn and soybeans, 83% of them were contaminated. This fact leads to two debilitating impacts. First, it harms the trade economy of the seller of these GM crops. Kim Anderson explains in the Journal of Economic Literature that nations often ban importation of GM crops and contaminated non-GM crops because of safety and environmental concerns. So that means we can't sell these GM crops to other nations. This is bad because the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization says that these happened 198 such incidents from every single region. These trade disruptions happened in 2012, and Patrick Holden of the Soil Association states within a few years of the introduction of GM crops, almost the entire 300 million annual US exports and 300 million Canadian exports to the EU have disappeared because we can't sell the GM crops. Second, it drives individual farmers to economic loss, bankruptcy, and even death. Sujatha Barayan of the Council of Responsible Genetics says Monsanto alone controls 90% of the seed market and patent them. These special patents, they make it illegal to sell the seeds or plants without having first acquired a license to use the seed for only 1 year and then buy another license after they use it. Therefore, not only farmers who patent the GE seeds, but even those who are completely unaware that their seeds are contaminated are subject to legal lawsuits. For example, according to Attorney Dan Ravitcher of the non-for-profit Public Patent Association, there's 144 lawsuits against America's family farmers and settled around 700 out of court between 1997 and 2000. And at the end of the day, Center for Food Safety estimates that Monsanto, the company, has pressured as many 4,500 farmers into paying settlements worth as much as $160 million. Thus, also, for example, in Iraq, these GM crops are so costly for these farmers every single year that Iraqi farmers have left their farms, 97% of them, and thus 90% of its overall agricultural productivity has decreased. And in the Philippines, 270,000 smallholder farmers are bankrupt. And third of all, in India, Walden Doll of the Nation furthers in October 2013, 270,000, many trapped in debt, committed suicide between 1993 and 2012. Therefore, prevent death, vote con.
Question?
Go ahead.
Grass time begins. Now, you said that monocultures increase the amount of pests in the region, right?
Yes.
But if GMs are pest resistant, why is this a problem?
Because it reduces biodiversity. For example, if one crop is, for example, resistant to some pests, there's going to be multiple, that means we're only relying on one crop. So if there's a modification, or in AP Bio we learn about modifications due to evolution, only the strongest bugs can survive, and that means that there's all sorts of other bugs, and if we don't have the biodiversity in these plants, then if one plant goes down, we don't have another alternative. For example, if a bad climate just destroys one type of crop, we don't have another alternative to go to because we're relying on only one crop, which is GM seeds. And that's only perpetuated right now because Monsanto has a 90% monopoly on these products, so that means only one crop, one company. Can I ask you a question?
Go ahead.
So, I know you haven't taken English, but in history, in the late 19th century and early 20th century, do you know what happened to the crop production?
No, I don't. Would you like to enlighten me?
It skyrocketed. There was a huge overproduction in the United States.
Okay, but do you agree that the early 1990s was the...
Do you know what happened after that?
What happened after that?
The Great Depression.
You think that the Great Depression happened in the 1990s?
Okay. So,
Have you taken English?
In the 20th century, late 19th century, early 20th century.
Okay.
So my point is, when supply increases and the demand stays the same, what happens to a price?
Can you repeat that, sorry? Sorry.
If the supply of something increases and the demand stays the same, what happens to the price?
It decreases.
It decreases, right?
That's correct.
So how do the farmers, when their own crops are sold for less money, how do they get money?
Well, first of all, your example is from way before GM crops have ever been invented.
No, but this is
not really topical to this round.
How is that not topical? It's economics.
But this is about GMOs, which weren't created until the 1990s for consumer production.
But isn't that still... Isn't that...
May I ask another question, please?
Well, my point is that you say that 68% of the, there's an increase of 68% in the farmers' incomes, right?
In farmer profits.
In farmer profits.
That's correct.
And why? Why does that happen?
Because number one, there is an increased crop yield due to GM implementation, and because they're spending less money on pesticides, because GMs are pest resistant, they make more money off the crops.
So pest resistance leads to more yields, and more yields leads to more.
No, more yields and pest resistance are two factors that GM crops have implemented.
Now, the world has a lot of problems, but look to our opponent's case and see that their case has more problems. They tell you that monocultures have been developing due to the use of GM crops. However, their own evidence states that monocultures began developing in the early 1900s. So, GM crops only came 90 years later. So how can monocultures have developed as a result of GMs if GMs existed 90 years after the first monocultures were already appearing? Again, according to their own evidence. The first commercially grown GMO crop was a tomato called Flavor Saver. It saved flavor, but it will not save our opponent's case. Furthermore, they tell you that genetic diversity is lost due to monocultures. However, this has nothing to do with GMs. If monocultures had already existed since the early 1900s, then clearly monocultures are the problem and not GMs. They don't tell you that GMs are actually propagating monocultures. If the crop works better, farmers are going to grow them, and that should really not be any question in this round. Furthermore, lastly, they don't tell us any actual impact of losing genetic diversity. Okay, so we lose a few species. What's the big deal? If they're not telling us what's actually harming the earth about this, then we're not even going to consider that contention in this round, and we're simply going to move on. Monocultures are not because of GMs, and monocultures aren't inherently a problem that GMs have. They also tell us that when monocultures develop, a country's economy can be completely wrecked by freak weather accidents, viruses, and pests. However, again, this is non-unique to GMs. Since monocultures exist, again, since the 1900s, all of these problems of weather-destroying crops, viruses-destroying crops, and pests-destroying crops existed way before GMs existed, which was 90 years later. So there's essentially blaming the gasoline for car accidents, if you like to look at it from that analogy. They also tell us, lastly in this contention, that the number of pests in the world has increased due to the use of GM crops. One, this doesn't make sense, but two, let's look at empirical evidence. Klumper in 2011 cites a study showing that pesticide use decreased 37% worldwide. How can pests and therefore pest populations increase? Even if pest populations increase, again, what's the harm? Our opponents lack impacts. If pest populations grew empirically, that did nothing to harm crop yields, as our evidence clearly shows crop yields increased worldwide. The only harmful pest in this round is our opponent. Moving on to their second contention, gene contamination. They tell us that when genetically modified crops are grown, these genes can spread to other fields, thus causing farmers to be sued. However, they only tell us that 144 farmers have been sued since the early 1990s. That's 25 years and 144 cases. Now, Monsanto has 350,000 customers for all farmers. If only 144 or 147 out of 350,000 is enough to convince our opponents that GMs are bad, we need to reanalyze the numbers here. Now, I don't have a calculator on me, but do the percentages. An extreme minority of farmers are actually sued by Monsanto, and in those cases, they're actually saving crops, which is against the contract they signed when they buy the crops in the first place. They also tell you that farmers are harmed. Again, this is empirically untrue. Remember that 90% of the world's farmers that grow GM are in poor or developing nations. With that, look at this fact. Brooks in 2014 actually tells us that on a global scale, at the farm level, $18.8 billion there was an $18.8 billion increase in profits for farmers worldwide. For the 17-year period, from 1996 to 2012, farmers' income gain totaled $116.6 billion worldwide. Clearly, if farmers are benefiting more than GMs because they're able to grow more crops, they're able to sell these crops, and as they're earning a larger profit, this not only helps them feed themselves, their families, and their communities, but it also brings them out of poverty and helps their nation to develop, and especially in agricultural nations where farmers form the majority of the people workforce. Furthermore, Klumper in 2014 tells us that as a result of GMs being used, in 147 different studies, they all found that GM technology adoption increased crop yield by 22%. So look at the numbers here. We have a 22% increase in crop yields, and we have several $1 billion increased profit for farmers. For that reason, GMs actually increase farmers' profits. Lastly, they tell us that Monsanto is actually suing farmers, but in most cases, again, they're saving seed. And lastly, genetically modified food giants such as Monsanto actually paid the farmers back. Now, in one case, in 2015, March of this year, Monsanto actually paid back $350,000 to settle a case where Monsanto's GM pollen had flown into another field. So clearly, Monsanto is paying these farmers back if in any event that GMs are actually contaminating their crops. Again, look to all their impacts in this round and see that they clearly outweigh our opponents in our opponent's case.
So the con will now present its rebuttal to the affirmative case.
Is this working? Don't let humor make up for my opponent's lack of argumentation. A key observation before we dive into my opponent's case. First, impacts to small farmers are the most important in today's round. As they themselves tell you, 90% of people who produce lots of the world's poorest farmers. But more importantly, small farmers make the majority of the world's poor. With that being said, prefer actual tangible impacts of human welfare rather than the intangible impacts of my opponent's case. With that being said, move to their first contention, which talks about increased yields. Three key responses here. First, Louis Herrera explains the fundamental issue with this argument. Even if everything hypothetically they tell us is true, the problem is the world's poorest farmers can afford GM technology. But more importantly, the world's poorest countries don't have the infrastructural development or the state capacity to capitalize on all the benefits of GM technology. Insofar as that's true, their impacts won't materialize in the real world. But second, my opponent creates a lot of studies from the Klumper meta-analysis of 147 studies and the PG economics work score. They try to say that there's an increase in farmer income. Three key issues with both these studies specifically. First, selection bias. Both PG Economics and Klumper use data exclusively provided by Monsanto. The reason why this is problematic is because Monsanto is very clearly the largest genetically modified organization in the world. Obviously, the data they're using is biased because they want more people and more small farmers to purchase their seeds. With that being said, look at the fact that the Food and Water Europe Watch finds that overall Monsanto has inflated the data my opponents talk about by nearly 80%. Clearly, the data isn't reliable. But second, we can use this argument against my opponents because it relies on super weeds. In fact, according to the Canadian Biotechnology Action Network, herbicide-tolerant GM crops suspend that large areas of cropland are repeatedly sprayed with the same herbicide. This is problematic for a couple of reasons. First, herbicides become inefficient in the long term. Over time, the strongest of the weeds are able to survive the herbicide and pass on the traits to future offspring that can withstand the poison, as Arthur talks about in the first cross-examination. Ultimately, strong weeds proliferate, which take away the soil nutrients that could have otherwise gone to increasing the crop yields my opponents are talking about. But second, Charles Benbrook, who analyzes 15 years of data from 1995 to 2011, finds that overall, GM technology has risen the overall use of pesticide use by 404 million pounds. This is significant for a couple of reasons. First, Benbrook looks long-term. My opponent's evidence is just in the short term, but Benbrook analyzes 15 years. But more importantly, the reason why pesticide use increases because, as we tell you in our first contention, when you grow genetically modified crops, you do it in a mass monoculture, which means if you have more crops, you need more pesticides. When you have more pesticides, the farmer has to spend more money, there's less profits. But third, yields actually decrease because superweeds make growing crops inefficient and Clumber's analysis is biased. The Institute for Responsible Technology, which analyzes 400 of the world's smartest scientists and 50 international governments, finds that conventional crops, not GM crops, comparatively have a 79% higher yield. Because every time a farmer chooses to grow a genetically modified crop, he isn't growing a conventional crop. This means that all byproduct impacts are 79% less if we choose to affirm the resolution. Let's now move to the second contention, which talks about environmental benefits. Two key responses here. First, we recognize that climate change is an issue, but GMOs do not solve the problem in the real world. We have to recognize that the entire environmental benefit my opponent's talking about is very contrived. In the long term, no-till agriculture my opponent's talking about is actually worse. In fact, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, no-till soil releases nitrous oxide and methane from soils and concluded that, quote, harms will outweigh benefits in 35 years. That's an on-net analysis that says that no-till agriculture isn't good. But even so, no-till agriculture still existed prior to the 1900s, so use your own argument against them because very clearly it's not used genetically modified foods. But second, this is the most important response. MIT writes that because GMOs encourage mass monocultures, they hurt biodiversity, which in turn completely destroys the vitality of biological ecosystems. Now, in his rebuttal, Bernie tries to say, well, what's the problem with hurting a few species? Well, the problem is, insofar as MIT finds to hurt biological ecosystems, the European Union finds that overall, biological ecosystems are responsible for consuming 50% of all man-made carbon emissions. They can give us the 6.8 million kilograms statistic, that sounds great, but comparatively, 50% of all man-made carbon emissions is a far greater stature. But second, remember that this is a long-term structural harm. The impacts that we're talking about have to be prioritized the most because they're damaging biological ecosystems, which is harder to reverse, but more importantly, is exponentially more permanent. Overall, ask yourself a very simple question on the ground. The impacts they give us of increased yields and increased profits are all biased because they're coming from Monsanto. Arthur and I are giving you real-world unbiased analyses, where as a result of the monopoly that Monsanto has, 270,000 small farmers are in debt and they're bankrupt, but more importantly, they're leaving their farms, which means they can't plant the crops if they don't get the benefits my farmers talking about.
Alright, I'll take your question. Alright, Bryce, so you tell us that monocultures lead to a decrease in genetic diversity. But since monocultures existed since the 1900s, why is this GMO crops fault?
I'm glad you brought that up. It's because monocultures existed prior to genetically modified foods. Just like the argument, we show that because genetically modified foods are typically grown in mass quantities. That's what Monsanto does, remember? They sell these seeds in mass quantities.
And no one grew crops in mass quantities before GMOs?
Right, but we're telling you that, no. We're telling you that the reason why genetically modified seeds are unique is because Monsanto, which is the inactive corporation, only sells their seeds in mass quantities. And that's why genetically modified foods and mass monocultures are inextricably linked. But more importantly, even if what your hypothetical analysis is true, that's why empirically, in the real world, there's been a decrease in genetic diversity by 75%. But I have a question for you. Let's talk about this Humber meta-analysis and these Brooks arguments and farmer income increase. So, what is Monsanto's, what is a corporation's motive?
To sell their product.
So, do you think that Monsanto wants to sell more of their seeds?
Obviously.
So
Right. If your point is going to be that every single step you decide is biased, we can also say the same.
I mean, it's
If
not
you're
aware
of
that
it.
bias, that you guys pick bias.
You guys make biased studies as well if you're going to run that argument.
Maybe a single
Because remember that many people are against GMs, and if people are going to run pro-GM arguments, false evidence just to promote GMs, then people are going to run anti-GM arguments just to cut
Okay, I mean, well, our evidence looks at both the pros and the cons of GMs and comes to a net result. But anyways, kind of avoiding your question. You would agree that if Monsanto is providing the data that both Brooks and Humber use, clearly there's some sort of profit motive, right?
Okay.
Can that data be trusted if it's coming from a corporation that has a vested interest to sell their own product?
Well, if it's coming from the... Repeat your question.
Yeah, I mean, you can agree that obviously if corporations have a vested interest to make their commodities look good, then it's not a good idea to look at that data, right?
Why is every piece of evidence that comes from a company inherently biased?
Okay, as you just answered, obviously Monsanto wants to sell its seeds. So Monsanto's going to want to support PG economics because PG economics is saying that their seeds have higher yields. So you would agree that your analysis has some sort of bias, right?
Inherently not. Especially, let's say GM, all the GM crops they've been selling are actually harmful. Wouldn't a study be beneficial?
Alright,
since
we're
they're
kind of
fine?
going no. Do you have a question for me?
Alright, sure. So you say that GM contamination is harmful to U.S. farmers.
Yeah.
Why is it harmful to them if a small minority of them?
That's okay. First off, two key responses to that question. First, remember, we tell you according to UC Berkeley that genetically modified crops and conventional crops cannot coexist. Why? Because wind blows over genetically modified seeds, and that goes into a neighboring farmer's farm. Why is that bad? Because Monsanto has patented those seeds. So now Monsanto has the leverage to sue those small farmers. It's not insignificant insofar as we tell you that it costs small farmers $1 billion every single year.
Yeah, how many farmers are there total in the U.S.?
I'm not sure. There's a lot, but irrespective.
There's more than 144, right?
Irrespective. 144 farmers.
Out of 350,000 of Monsanto's customers. I think that's an extremely small
Okay,
percentage.
so that's the evidence that you read, which says that Monsanto only pushed through 9, right?
Push through what?
Monsanto only pushed through 9, right?
Even if they only push through 9.
So the argument that Arthur and I would make is the reason why that's true is because Monsanto settles a lot of these disputes out of court, and that is total $160 million every single year.
Just to clarify, at this point, usually in a debate, both sides get something called an off-time roadmap just to tell you what they're going to do through this summer speech. So as an example, as a brief off-time roadmap, I'm going to be addressing 2 key voting issues, crop yields and agribusiness. Does anyone need one there? Time begins. Yeah. First of all, one key observation. Although the study that they claimed by Comfort was funded by Monsanto, all the research done was independent. If they claim that every study in our case is going to be biased, you cannot trust us, you cannot trust them, you cannot trust anybody in the world. For this reason, you're going to trust all of our cases and all of our studies because they don't actually prove that Monsanto funded this. They don't quantify how much Monsanto technically inflamed these studies, and they don't prove how this is actually biased. So if you move on, just trust this Comfort study and trust all our evidence for it right now because they haven't actually provided that this cannot be trusted. Voting issue 1, crop yields. On their side, they bring up monocultures. Let's look at these. Let's look at the problems with their monocultures evidence. First of all, they say that 75% of crop diversity has been reduced since 1900 due to monocultures. Number 1, this is not an effect of GM crops at all. This is an effect of monocultures. They don't say how much, since GMOs were actually implemented into the mass market, how much genetic diversity has been reduced. Due to this, they haven't actually proven either or quantified what genetic diversity has to do with anything. They don't state why is it a problem. They don't give it any impact about genetic diversity. So you're not going to flow this onto your round at all. You're just going to trust the fact that genetic diversity apparently is a bad thing for the environment. No, you can't do that. They don't explain it to you. They don't do any analysis for this. So you're not going to trust this evidence. Prefer our side instead about this Comfort meta-analysis showing trends of increased crop yields by 22%. You're going to trust this increase in crop yields because again, they don't show that it's inherently biased. Our impacts simply outweigh theirs because they don't have any in their first intention. So their first intention about monocultures simply has no stem to stand on. Voting issue number 2, agribusiness. Look to our opponent's side. First of all, they cite isolated studies like in the Philippines and Iraq about how farmers technically lost their incomes. However, they don't quantify or even enumerate the decrease in income that these farmers face. They simply say that they decrease in income, or somehow that 270 farmers went into debt. 270,000 farmers went into debt. Or the fact that 200,000 committed suicide. They don't tell you why they committed suicide. They simply said they committed suicide. They don't actually tie this to genetically modified organisms. And the Philippines and Iraq are unquantified. Instead, you are going to prefer our evidence of the Comfort meta-analysis again, and the case study that we cited from South Africa, in which beefy corn increased crop yields by 11% and increased farmer incomes by $117 per hectare grown. And lastly, we strongly agree.
Close ready? Partner? Is everyone ready? Yeah. Okay. Alright. Bryce and I negate today's round because my opponents just give you pretty numbers and pretty statistics, but we're going to show you the reasons why. So, the 2 reasons why you must vote for us is first on the environment, and second is on small farmers. So our basic argument on the environment is that the environment is harmed because when planting a single variety of crops, it decreases biodiversity. So because of these fluctuations, the nature, we can't really adapt to those changes, so we have increased pests and trade disruptions. And they say that monocultures existed before, but that's just the same thing as saying murder still existed before guns, so murder isn't bad at all. But at the end of the day, GMs actually increase the impacts of the environment. Second is going to be on the impact on small farmers. Our argument is that the Monsanto controls 90% of the industry, and since the contamination rate is high, farmers are targeted by lawsuits. Even people who don't plant the GMOs, and are also forced to pay high prices and landed debt. They give you these Comfort studies that give you pretty numbers, about 68% in profit, and about all those things. But the problem is that it's biased. I read the study. Kane literally says we included all the publications, not just peer-reviewed studies. So they can just include anything in that study, and they say it's good. However, we give you 400 scientists that say it comparatively 79% increase, 79% higher yield of conventional crops, So at the end of the day, we have to look at the impacts to small farmers. Because of this monopoly, small farmers in Iraq, 90% of them are left because they can't afford these seeds, and 270,000 farmers in the Philippines actually are bankrupt. 270,000 people in India are committing suicide because they're bankrupt, and in the United States itself, 300 million are being paid to Monsanto because of these settlements. So even if GMOs themselves, even if you agree with them that GMOs themselves are good, the fact of the matter is that farmers cannot afford it. So let's not support this devastating institution. Let's support the small farmers. Thank you.
Alright, so out of 350,000 farmers that buy GM products, how many of them were actually sued in the last 20 years?
We told you that there is 140.
Okay, so isn't that a significant minority?
That's not, just because it's a minority doesn't negate the fact that it actually happens. And second of all, it means that it gives the power to a company like Monsanto to perpetually bring lawsuits forever. That's an infinite amount of lawsuits in the future if we let Monsanto control the economy.
However, in a lawsuit back against Monsanto, Monsanto had to pay them back. We stated evidence of this. Would you like me to reread it? Genetically modified food giant Monsanto said it would pay about $350,000 to settle class action lawsuits.
Okay, so let's do some math here. You say 150,000 or 170,000, right?
350,000, yeah, that's right.
But at the end of the day, farmers paid $160 million. So subtract $170,000 from 100.
Okay, that's the vast majority. We're talking about the people that were only sued. These 144 farmers.
At the end of the day, on net, farmers pay more to Monsanto, correct?
But in addition, the reason why that statistic seems a little inflated is because that's only the losses that have actually gone to court. Keep in mind that it's retail in the contention. Monsanto also settles a lot of these disagreements and disputes outside of court, which is what also costs $1 billion every single year.
You have a question?
Yeah.
So, you tell me that in your second contention about the environment, correct?
That's right.
And you say all these benefits, but how do we actually weigh the environmental effects in today's round? Because you don't give any tangible impact.
Wait, what do you mean, how do we weigh the environment?
Like, can you quantify the impacts in the real world?
Of course, a reduction in erosion by 90%, a greenhouse gas emissions reduction by 80%. We gave you all these impacts. These are already quantified. What do you mean, how do we weigh the environment?
So you said like 40 kilograms or something like...
14.2 billion kilograms of carbon dioxide.
What does that number even mean?
It means that 14.2 billion kilograms of carbon dioxide was removed from the
Yeah,
atmosphere.
but how does that affect me?
Do you grow GMs? I'm not sure what you're actually asking. How does it affect you? It affects the Earth. These 14.2 billion kilograms of carbon dioxide is being removed from the atmosphere. You can't say this is a non-significant number without suggesting an alternative.
Here's why it's problematic. Here's why it's problematic. The issue of climate change is gigantic. Taking like 6.8 billion cars off the road or whatever, it may sound like a good thing. But in the grand scheme of climate change, explain to Arthur and I how that's actually alleviating the impacts of climate change, how that's slowing down emissions, how that's actually benefiting people and individuals.
So what you're saying is that we have to prove that GM solve all the world problems?
Obviously not. I'm
and to
asking you to
decrease the
explain
amount of
how the
pollution.
problem is reduced.
But the only thing we have to prove is the benefits of genetically modified foods outweigh the harms. And if we're showing that GMs actually improve upon the status quo by reducing the amount of pollution, then that is...
Alright, do you have a question?
Alright, sure. Alright, so you say that 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 monocultures are due to GMs and that's somehow harmful. But again, how is this genetically modified?
As Arthur talks about, murder existed prior to it.
You can finish your answer. So, as a brief off-time roadmap. Wait, let's go on. Great, as a brief off-time roadmap, we'll be going down their three contentions and explaining why our impacts outweigh theirs. And that time begins now. Let's do their first contention where they tell you, again, that monocultures are leading to decreased genetic diversity, and somehow that's GMO's fault. Again, look, their evidence is from the beginning of the 1900s. If they're going to say the beginning of the 1900s, then we say that GMOs only existed since the 1990s. So their impact of 75% genetic diversity lost doesn't really matter because that's actually not GMO's fault. That's all monocultures since which have existed again for over 90 years since the creation of GMs. So any of their impacts they're going to say about the environment or genetic diversity loss doesn't really matter because it's non-topical. Again, since 1900s doesn't matter. That was before GMs were actually developed. Their second contention is that farmers are being sued in the U.S. due to crop contamination. However, we tell you in the cases that do happen in that way, the company Monsanto actually pays the farmers back. And further, in many of the cases, the farmers actually did hold on to their seeds. Lastly, 144 farmers out of 350,000 GM farmers in the U.S. That number simply isn't going to prove that GMs are harmful as a whole. Consider again that they say that the world poor farmers are going to be considered highly. We tell you that 90% of the world's farmers actually grow, or 90% of GMs actually grown by poor farmers, and they're being greatly benefited. Again, look at the 147 studies showing a huge increase in profit and crop yields for those growing GM. Lastly, their contention about Monsanto. That's already been addressed. Monsanto actually pays the farmers back, and again, the benefits far outweigh the harms of a vast minority of court cases. Now let's move on to our impacts, which far outweigh theirs. We tell you that yields are up worldwide. Now, they're going to claim that these 147 studies we cite are all biased just because they're pro-GM. However, this simply doesn't make sense. If they're going to call every pro-study that we bring up biased, we may as well not be debating, since they're just going to call every single study wrong. So these 147 studies are going to be weighed over their 0 studies showing that GMs actually reduce crop yields. All evidence points that crop yields are up and profits are up, as well as pesticide use is down. Our other impact is the environment. Now, they tell you that we can't quantify the benefits to the environment. If we're improving on the status quo of global pollution, then clearly GMs are benefiting the environment, the world, and everyone in this room. For that reason, vote pro.
Alright, so as Driven did, I'm also going to give an off-campus map. My first voting issue will be their argument about increased yields, and the second will be small farms. Two key reasons to negate the resolution. First, on my opponent's case on the increased yields. 3 key problems. First, they drop Herrera, which is the most important piece of evidence on this topic. What Herrera finds is, even if all the hypothetical benefits or the benefits of GM technology my opponents talk about is true, the problem is the world's poorest farmers can't afford GM technology. That means right there, all the incomes and increased incomes we're talking about are the farmers that aren't these small farmers that we talk about in our case are so important. But second, their studies are biased. Remember, they drop the evidence in the Food and Water Watch does a separate analysis and finds that Monsanto inflated the data by as much as 80%. That's clearly not reliable. But third, the Institute for Responsible Technology, which analyzes 400 of the world's smartest scientists and 50 international governments, finds that overall, comparatively, conventional crops have 79% higher yields. Magnify all their benefits by 79%, that's what happens if you choose to negate the resolution. Second, look at small farmers. We impact the small farmers in 2 key ways, but remember, the root cause of the reason why is because Monsanto has a monopoly of the industry. First, through lawsuits. Now remember, we tell you through genetic contamination, because patented seeds can go to another farmer's farm because of wind, now Monsanto can sue those farmers. They give us a couple of responses. First, they say that Monsanto pays them back $350,000. Very clear that's less than the $1 billion that it costs small farmers every single year. But second, more importantly, they say it's only 144 lawsuits. But remember, the reason why that may be true is because the majority of the cases are settled out of court, which is why overall it costs small farmers $160 million every single year. But second, through bankruptcy. This is the most important voting issue round. It's incredibly critical because overall we tell you that because small farmers are dependent on genetically modified seeds, Monsanto jacks up the price 282%. Why is that problematic? Well, first, in the Philippines, 270,000 small farmers are in debt. Here's why this is problematic. When a small farmer is in debt, he can no longer afford his farm, which is empirically what's happening in Rockney status quo. If farmers now bankrupt and lease their farm, they have no farm. If they have no farm, they can't plant GM crops, they don't get the benefits of increased yield, they don't get any of the benefits my opponents talk about if a farmer is losing his farm because of the bankruptcy caused by genetically modified seeds. That's unique to the industry. Overall, support the small farmer, not the industry, and not the monopoly of genetically modified foods, because we impact the actual small farmers rather than a plethora of unwarranted statistics. That's why we ought to negate it. Thank you.